Shana Tova. The bulletin went out across the world. The day had come. The apocalypse was nigh. The news over the wireless said, "People of the earth, in 3 days we will be submerged underwater." And once it was ascertained that that was real, the leaders of the Jewish community got together and discussed what they ought to say. They gathered their flock and they scoured Jewish tradition for wisdom that they could share with their congregants and friends. A very traditional rabbi, looking at our ancient worship patterns, said, "Friends, chevra, let us burn incense and bring sacrifices, and thus we might avert the evil decree. We have 3 days." Another rabbi, speaking to his flock, looked in later Jewish history, saw how the people had conducted themselves in other times, and said, "Chevra, friends, we have 3 days. Let us pray and sing and compose hymns and study. We have 3 days." And another rabbi, looking over her community, looked again at Jewish history and said, "Chevra, friends, we have 3 days to learn how to breathe underwater." We are an innovative people. And that story strikes a very deep chord. We are innovative and adaptable. And that's indicated in more ways than I could possibly count. But one of the ways that we constantly bring newness is to not shy away from reading the same passages over and over and over again, always looking for something new in them, because we are different every time we meet them. Some communities do not share the Genesis reading for day one. They might skip directly to the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, or they might read passages from Genesis. This is, after all, the commemoration of the creation of the earth. But I confess I am a moth to flame when it comes to these particular verses in Genesis 22. In just a few verses, there are so many raised issues, any one of which could capture our attention in any given year. Issues of faith, issues of how we treat our elders, issues of family dynamics, relationships between women, power structures, the patriarchy, the matriarchy, how we receive foreigners in our midst, how we treat our children, issues of reproductive rights, how we watch politicians and leaders negotiate with one another to create a pact. Over and over again, this brief section beckons us to ask, what is it this year that strikes you at your core? Dear congregant, a couple of weeks ago, and I were talking about how easy it is to drift into, quote, politics. And we agreed that if we did nothing else but read these verses, just the translation in English, and let them float out over our community and out through cyberspace, we would likely each hear them through a political lens. Something in them would strike a chord to say, this is what I hear today, in my time, thousands of years after these good and complicated and fascinating people walked the earth. But I will confess that this year, the chord that is striking so deeply for me are the repeated references in this text to water. If you look closely, there are more than maybe immediately meets the eye. Genesis 21 begins, Adonai took note of Sarah as promised. And of course, what she had scoffed at was that she would not have sufficient water to continue the ability, she had long ago lost it, but to regain the ability to bear a child, an eminently watery experience. She laughs, will I have moisture, enjoyment from my husband at this late stage in my life? And so we begin with the notion of pregnancy. Who shall bear and who shall go barren? And even from the very opening notes of this parsha and this section that we read from, we are thinking of the birth waters. But when there is strife in the family and emotional and psychological abuse and banishment, when Hagar and Ishmael are sent out into the wilderness, they go with a little bread and a skin of water. When the water was gone from the skin, Hagar left the child under one of the bushes and went and sat down at a distance. When the water was gone, Hagar despaired. Not 2 sentences later, after Hagar and her son are heard and seen, what of course do they see in the wilderness? She sees a well for the first time. Was it there before? Was it put there just at that moment? And through her interaction with God, she is able to see the well. The Torah doesn't tell us. But what we do know was that a well of water sustains her hope in the wilderness. And she finds it after her divine encounter. She fills the skin with water and lets the boy drink. And they are sustained and restored. And they go and they succeed mightily. And in a passage that seems sometimes almost out of place at that point, but is magnificently stitched together, the remainder of the reading is a settlement over a dispute about water. In verse 25, out of seemingly nowhere, Abraham reproaches Abimelech for the well of water which the servants of Abimelech had seized. Abimelech and we have the same response. I don't know who did this. You didn't tell me, nor have I heard of it until today. It seems to be dropped suddenly out of a clear blue sky. What was this well of water over which they had argued, from which Abraham was barred from access for a while? I have a strange thought it might be a veiled reference to Sarah, actually, because for a while Sarah was in Abimelech's home in that infamous "she is my sister" incident earlier. But barring any actual proof for that, because Sarah does become the wellspring of life for Abraham in his later years, and the fulfillment of the covenant and the promise, nonetheless, this is on its face a dispute about water. You might say, I have water on the mind. these days. It's nearly impossible to open our newspapers without seeing headlines such as this one from 2 days ago: Parched California should expect a fourth dry year. When the water is gone, we begin to despair. Every single drop counts, my friends. You know that as well as I. We have daily negotiations with our water. How much to water the plants versus the people, the dishes versus the clothing, how much to drink and how much to learn to do without. The plants and the dishes, by the way, generally win. In Los Angeles, we have in a prominent place now our water restrictions. The days that we can and can't water, the hours that we can and can't. And neighbors have even taken to gently remonstrating their neighbors if their sprinklers are on at the wrong times. We don't want our good neighbors to have fines or other punishments. It's not a game, but we approach it as a challenge. How can we make this water last? This liquid gold, the absolute stuff of life. We are trying to train ourselves for the greater cuts that we know will come. And it would be a most remarkable act of teshuvah, of repair, wouldn't it? If we could each of us examine our relationship with water and see where we might do better to preserve this precious and fleeting resource. And yet, if you're anything like me, you might feel a little bit confused at times. There is so much water where there shouldn't be, and so little water where there should. In what I feel was the same day of a news cycle, I saw a story about the aridification of the West, and at the same time heard a story that we should prepare for unprecedented flooding. I feel torn in multiple directions, but regardless of what comes, we're trying to train ourselves to look at every drop as the invaluable gift that it is while we have it. This reading for Rosh Hashanah invites me back every year, and I am never disappointed. Later today, and actually any time through the Sukkot holiday, although it's preferred if you can manage it prior to Yom Kippur, we have a water-based ritual built into our observance. It's the Tashlich ceremony. It will happen today for our community with Am Tikva at 1:45 at Lake Merced, and it is based primarily on verses from the prophets. But if you look at our reading for today, almost exactly in the middle of the reading, no accidents, the phrase Vatashlech et hayeled tachat achad hasichim. Hagar cast off the boy under one of the bushes. The seed of Tashlich, the water ceremony, is right here in the heart of our Torah. Hagar casts off Ishmael when she cannot bear to see his suffering. And yet, There is so much that can happen at the side of a natural body of water, today or in the coming days. Tashlich actually doesn't appear in every single High Holiday prayer book. It's an indication that some of the rabbis over the centuries felt that this folk custom of going to a water's edge and symbolically casting our transgressions into the water through breadcrumbs, some use pebbles, might be considered a superstition, such that some people might feel if they do that, they're done with their obligation for repenting. So some rabbis over the centuries tried to dissuade the custom, and yet it has such a deep resonance to stand at a well, at a pond, at a lake, or at the ocean, and bid farewell to the year that was by turning out our pockets or casting a few breadcrumbs on the water, feeling them wash away. And if you're particularly at the ocean, watching the waves come in and feeling the pull of the creation that began, of course, with water and the separation of the waters. People insisted on doing the tashlich ceremony because it's delightful. It's a relief after maybe a long morning in synagogue. We are so blessed to have the weather we do here, but there are those in very warm places today experiencing Rosh Hashanah. So to go to a place of water fulfills such a need. This is a birth, and the waters represent that birth. It's a casting away of the old year. And yet I think we might think of it as something else. We might take a moment to consider the things we want to wash away and other things that we might have cast away that need to be regathered. Vatashlech et hayeled. Hagar cast away the boy, but when they appreciate the blessing again of water and they are graced with it, they gather each other up and they keep going. I think ultimately that for me is the pull, the appeal of these water images. It is a time of rebirth, a time of celebration of the universe and the waters from which our lives originally sprung. But it's also a time to regather, to consider what we've sent away from our lives, what we've cast off that needs to be brought back in, watered and nurtured. Whether you cast bread into the water or just stand and, like Hannah in the beautiful Haftarah, pour out your soul like water. Whether or not you're able to go to a body of water that has fish. Fish have a lot of symbolism. On the high holy days, the eyes of the fish never close. We imagine that to be related to the unblinking eye of God, reviewing our behavior. Of course, fish multiply, and we hope that our good deeds will multiply like the fish. It was superstitions and symbolism like that that the rabbis were a little uncomfortable with, some of the less poetic ones. But whatever you do, whether it's even to gaze into a glass of clear water, and I pray you see it as half full, this year may we gather to our hearts the blessing of water. Let our Torah teach us that our disputes should not be over water, but if they are, we can follow the example of Abraham and Abimelech, creating a covenant and coming to a place of agreement and sharing and compromise. Let us each consider the role that water plays in our lives. We are mostly water after all. And on this day of celebration and recrowning of the King of Heaven, let us cherish each and every drop. Let it wash over us. And ultimately, by doing so, let us live by the words of the prophet Amos. Let justice flow down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream. May we know the blessing of abundant and healthy water that so many right now do not know in cities in our own country. Nebuch. Let us give thanks for our nearness here to the ocean, for the waves and the still cool and moist air that is San Francisco's. Let us never take for granted one cool, clean, healthy drink of water. May we know these blessings for now and always. May you be blessed, my friends. Shana Tova.